she said forever. But unspoken truths nearly destroyed their love the very night it was meant to begin. Clara Whitmore, a hopeful bride who believed love was built on honesty, stood in her wedding dress still glowing from the vows she had just made, while Ethan Cole, the man she trusted with her future, stood only a few steps away, hiding something he had never found the courage to say. Everything about their love had felt real. Careful. Intentional. But even in their happiest moments, there were silences. Silences when Clara asked about his past. Silences when certain names came up. Silences that felt small then, but now echoed loudly. Because love didn't just break with lies, it broke with truths left unspoken. And tonight, those truths were no longer hiding. A single message, a single name, a single pause from Ethan that lasted just a second too long, and suddenly, forever didn't feel safe anymore. Clara's heart began to race as everything she had ignored started connecting in ways she couldn't unsee, because the man she married was not just holding back a secret, he was holding back a truth that could change everything. But what was Ethan hiding that was so powerful it could destroy their love overnight? Who was the woman connected to his silence, and why did her presence feel like a threat to Clara's forever? And the most terrifying question of all, if love was real, why wasn't the truth? The room still smelled like fresh roses and soft perfume. Clara Whitmore stood at the center of the hotel suite, her wedding dress slightly loosened at the waist, her heels abandoned near the door. Everything about the night was supposed to feel magical, complete. Instead, something felt off. It wasn't loud. Not obvious, just a quiet unease sitting in her chest. Behind her, Ethan Cole was humming softly, loosening his tie in front of the mirror. His reflection looked calm, almost too calm for a man who had just said forever hours ago. Clara smiled faintly at him through the mirror. "You're unusually relaxed," she teased gently. Ethan chuckled. "Isn't that a good thing?" "Maybe," she replied. But her voice carried a question she didn't fully understand yet. She turned away, walking toward the bedside table where his phone lay. It buzzed once. Then again. Clara hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, but because something inside her whispered, "Look." She picked it up slowly. The screen lit up. And in that single second her world shifted. "You still haven't told her the truth. Or should I?" The sender's name wasn't saved, just a number. Clara's fingers tightened around the phone. Her heartbeat began to rise, not in panic yet, but in recognition of something she had felt before, but ignored. Behind her, Ethan's humming stopped. "Clara," he called softly. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, her eyes drifted over the message again. The truth, not a truth, not something small. The truth. Her mind began connecting things she had once dismissed. The way Ethan avoided certain questions, the way he paused when she mentioned his past, the way he sometimes stared into nothing, like he was remembering something he couldn't say out loud. Clara turned slowly. "Ethan." Her voice was steady, but only just. He looked at her now, fully, sensing something had changed. "What is it?" She stepped closer, holding up the phone. "Who is this?" Ethan's eyes flicked to the screen. And in that instant Clara saw it. Not guilt, not exactly, but something far more dangerous. Fear. Real, unguarded fear. "It's nothing," he said quickly, stepping forward. "Just someone trying to stir trouble." Clara didn't move. Then what truth are they talking about? Silence. Heavy. Stretching. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Clara, tonight isn't the night for this." Her heart cracked just slightly, because that sentence felt familiar. Not the words, but the avoidance behind them. "Then when is the night, Ethan?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. And that hesitation, that single, fragile pause felt louder than any confession. Clara swallowed hard, her voice trembling now, despite her effort to stay calm. "Who is Olivia?" Ethan froze. The name hung in the air, like something alive. Something waiting. His silence confirmed everything her heart didn't want to believe. Clara's grip on the phone loosened slightly. "Ethan." Her voice broke this time. "What did you not tell me?" Ethan really looked at her now. And for the first time that night, he didn't look like her husband. He looked like a man standing on the edge of losing everything. Clara had always been the kind of woman who built her life carefully, line by line, like the manuscripts she edited. As a senior editor in one of the city's most respected publishing firms, she wasn't just successful, she was precise. Authors trusted her with their stories because she noticed what others missed: inconsistencies, hidden meanings, unfinished thoughts. Ironically, the same skill that made her exceptional at work had slowly started whispering warnings in her personal life. But love had a way of softening logic. Ethan Cole had entered her world quietly, almost like a story she hadn't planned to read, but couldn't put down. He wasn't wealthy in the loud, obvious sense. No flashy cars, no public displays. But there was a quiet stability around him, an understated kind of wealth that didn't need to prove itself. The first time Clara visited his apartment, she noticed it immediately: minimalist, tasteful, expensive without trying to look expensive, a rare first edition book casually placed on a shelf, a watch not design allowed, but unmistakably valuable, and a drawer he closed a little too quickly. When she walked in, "Writer's mess," he had said with a soft smile. She believed him, because everything else about him felt true. He remembered details no one else did. "You don't like red roses," he had said once, handing her a bouquet of white lilac instead. Clara had blinked in surprise. "I mentioned that once." "You mentioned things once," he replied, "but they matter." And that was how he loved her: through attention, through presence, through quiet understanding. But even then, there were gaps, not obvious enough to accuse, but present enough to feel. Once, during dinner, Clara had asked casually, "Have you ever been engaged before?" Ethan had paused just for a second, then smiled. No, the answer was clean. But the pause, was and single quotes d. And now, standing in that hotel room, that single pause came rushing back to her like a warning she had ignored. "Say something, Ethan," Clara whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. His mind was racing, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew the moment he said it, everything would change. "You deserve to know," he finally said, his voice low. Clara's breath caught, but he didn't continue. Not yet. And that delay, that hesitation, felt like the beginning of the end. Clara didn't hear the rest of Ethan's sentence that night, not because he didn't speak, but because her mind had already begun pulling her backwards, back to where it all started, back to the beginning of a love that had once felt too intentional to fail. She met Ethan Cole on a quiet Tuesday afternoon at Whitmore and Hale Publishing, a place known not just for its prestige, but for the kind of authors it attracted: people with layered minds and complicated stories. Clara was already respected there, not just as an editor, but as the one who could fix what didn't make sense. Colleagues often joked that nothing escaped her: not a misplaced word, not a broken timeline, not even a hidden motive buried deep inside a character. Ironically, that gift didn't protect her from what was unfolding now. Ethan wasn't supposed to stand out that day, but he did, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that quietly held it. He sat across from her in the meeting room, dressed simply, a notebook in front of him, his eyes observant but guarded, like a man who had learned to say less than he knew. "I don't just want to publish a story," he had said during their first meeting, his voice calm, steady. "I want it to feel true." Clara remembered studying him for a moment longer than necessary, sensing something deeper beneath his words. "Truth is expensive," she replied. "Most people don't realize that until it costs them something." A flicker passed through his eyes, then quick, almost invisible, but it was there. "I already know that," he said quietly. That should have been the first clue. But it wasn't enough to alarm her. Instead, it intrigued her. Their meetings became frequent, not because they had to, but because neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. What started as professional conversations slowly blurred into something more personal, more intimate, though never forced. Ethan didn't flirt in obvious ways. He listened, deeply, attentively, like every word Clara said mattered more than anything else happening around him. "You overthink things," he told her once, a soft smile on his lips. "It's my job," she replied. "No." He shook his head slightly. "It's how you protect yourself." That was the moment Clara realized he wasn't just observing her, he was understanding her. And that kind of connection was rare. But even in those early days, there were moments, small, almost forgettable moments that didn't fully align. One evening, as they stepped out of the office building, Clara noticed a black car parked across the street. It wasn't unusual, except Ethan noticed it too and immediately looked away, his body tightening just slightly. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he replied quickly. "Just thought I recognized someone." He didn't explain further. She didn't push. Another time, during a late editing session at his apartment, Clara wandered toward a shelf filled with books, her fingers tracing the spines until she noticed one missing space, an empty gap where something clearly belonged. "What was here?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Then, casually, "Just an old draft I threw away." But later that night, when he thought she wasn't looking, she saw him open a drawer, the same drawer he had once closed, to quickly and stare at something inside before shutting it again. These were not loud red flags, they were whispers. And Clara, who had spent her life fixing broken narratives, chose this time not to investigate, because everything else about Ethan felt real. He showed up, he cared, he listened, he remembered. When he took her to a quiet dinner weeks later, he didn't choose a flashy place, but the kind of restaurant where privacy mattered more than status. The owner greeted him with familiarity, not surprise, not curiosity, just quiet recognition. "You come here often?" Clara asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "Sometimes." "With who?" she teased lightly. Another pause. "Not many people." It was always like that, answers that were true, but never complete. And yet, Clara leaned into the parts she could see, not the ones hidden in shadow. Because love, when it begins gently, doesn't feel dangerous, it feels safe. And Ethan made her feel safe, safer than she had felt in years. What she didn't realize then was that Ethan wasn't just careful with his words, he was careful with his past. Not because he wanted to deceive her, but because he hadn't yet learned how to face it himself. And every time Clara chose not to question those small silences, she unknowingly allowed them to grow. Because unspoken truths don't disappear. They wait, they gather weight, and eventually, they demand to be heard. Back in the present, Clara's chest tightened, as those memories collided with the reality in front of her. Every pause, every silence, every almost answer, they all pointed to this moment. She looked at Ethan again, her eyes searching. No longer for comfort, but for truth. "You said I deserve to know," she whispered. "So tell me, who is Olivia?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping, if the weight he had been carrying could no longer be held back. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out yet. And in that silence, Clara realized something even more terrifying than the message itself. This wasn't something he had just hidden from her. It was something he had been running from long before she ever came into his life. And now, it had finally caught up with him. Clara's memory drifted again, pulling her into a moment she had once replayed with joy. A moment that now felt heavier with meaning she had not understood at the time. The night Ethan proposed. A night she believed was the clearest confirmation that their love was aligned. Intentional and real, yet beneath the surface, small details had already begun to hint at a story far larger than she could see. It had been on a rooftop overlooking the city, the skyline glowing with distant lights, the aircom almost perfect, as if the world itself had paused to witness something important. Ethan had asked her to meet him there without explanation, only saying, "Dress comfortably, but bring your heart with you." Clara had laughed then, thinking it was one of his subtle ways of being poetic, but now, that phrase echoed differently in her mind, like a quiet foreshadowing she had missed. When she arrived, Ethan was already there, standing near the edge, his hands resting on the railing, his posture still, thoughtful, as though he had been rehearsing a conversation within himself long before she stepped in. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and for a brief second, his expression softened completely, not forced, not performative, but genuine in a way that made Clara feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. "You came," he said, almost like he had been unsure she would. "You asked me to," she replied with a small smile, walking toward him. "I always come when it matters." That line, though simple, seemed to settle something in him, something he had been carrying quietly. He nodded slightly, then reached into his jacket pocket, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he understood the weight of what he was about to do. Clara noticed his hand pause for just a moment before pulling out a small velvet box. At the time, she had interpreted that pause as nervousness. Now, she wondered if it had been something else entirely. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but layered with emotion. "From the moment I met you, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit for a long time, that I wanted a life where I didn't have to hide parts of myself." Clara's heart softened at his words, not knowing that those same words carried a deeper meaning than she could yet understand. "I don't have a perfect past," he continued, his tone slightly lower now, "but with you, I want a future that is honest." There it was again, truth, honesty, something he kept returning to, almost like a promise he was making not just to her, but to himself. Clara reached out slightly, sensing the emotion behind his words. "Forever doesn't need perfection," she said softly, echoing her own belief. Ethan smiled faintly, but this time, there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, relief, mixed with something unresolved. He opened the box, revealing the ring. Its simplicity elegant, not extravagant, but meaningful in a way that felt intentional. Clara had noticed that too. It wasn't the kind of ring that screamed wealth, but it was clearly chosen with care. What she didn't know then was that Ethan had spent days selecting it, not based on price, but on symbolism, choosing something that represented stability rather than display. That choice reflected the man he was trying to be, but also hinted at a man who understood restraint, someone who had lived with limitations he never fully explained. As Ethan knelt, Clara felt her breath catch, her emotions rising as she watched the man she had grown to trust lower himself before her. Around them, the city lights blurred slightly in her vision, her heart focusing only on him. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I want a life with you. Not a perfect one, but a real one." He paused briefly, and in that pause, something subtle happened. His gaze flickered, just for a second, toward the horizon, as if something in his past had crossed his mind. Then he looked back at her and continued, "Will you marry me?" Clara didn't hesitate. She said yes with tears in her eyes, stepping forward as he stood, wrapping her arms around him as if holding on to something she had been waiting for her entire life. But even in that embrace, something unseen lingered in the background of that moment. Earlier that same evening, Ethan had received a call he had not answered in her presence. The caller ID had shown an unfamiliar number, one that appeared again later that night. And though he dismissed it at the time, the tension in his posture, when the phone vibrated, had not gone unnoticed by Clara, even if she chose not to question it then. And across the city, in a quiet cafe far from the rooftop, a woman sat alone, watching her phone screen, her expression unreadable as she sent a message that would eventually find its way into Clara's life. Olivia Hart, though Clara didn't know her name yet. The presence of someone connected to Ethan's past had already begun to move silently behind the scenes, waiting for the right moment to surface. At the time of the proposal, Clara saw only love, only intention, only a man choosing her. But layered beneath that moment were quiet threads, unresolved histories, unanswered calls, and connections that had not been fully severed. Ethan, on the other hand, stood there holding Clara, aware that the life he was stepping into was something he truly wanted, but also aware that parts of his past were not yet at rest, and that unresolved past was not done with him. It was only waiting. Clara had always believed that engagement was the safest stage of love, a bridge between promise and permanence, a time where everything should feel clearer. more settled, more defined, yet in her case, it became the stage where silence began to speak louder than words. In the weeks following the proposal, life seemed to align on the surface: shared dinners, late-night conversations, quiet mornings filled with small acts of care, but beneath those routines, subtle inconsistencies began to appear. Each one small enough to ignore, yet meaningful enough to remember. Ethan had moved naturally into her world, spending more time at her apartment than his own, blending his presence into her daily life in a way that felt comforting, even grounding. Clara noticed how easily he adapted to her routines, how he learned the exact time she preferred her coffee, how he remembered the order in which she arranged her books, how he always adjusted the lighting in the evening, because he knew she preferred soft tones when working. These were the details that made her feel understood. But understanding, she would later realize, does not always mean transparency. One evening, while Clara was reviewing a manuscript on her laptop, Ethan sat across from her, quietly typing on his own device, occasionally glancing up at her with a calm expression that seemed almost protective. "You work too hard," he said softly. Clara smiled without looking up. "Says the man who writes until 2 a.m. Ethan chuckled, but his laughter was brief, as though it ended before it fully began. Moments like that passed easily between them, but Clara's trained instincts, sharpened by years of analyzing incomplete narratives, began to notice patterns that didn't fully align. For instance, Ethan always stepped out to take certain calls, not all calls, just specific ones, and when he did, his tone would shift subtly, becoming more reserved, more controlled. Clara once asked, casually, "Work again?" He nodded. "Freelance deadlines?" She accepted the answer, but her mind stored the inconsistency. Freelancers usually discuss their work openly. Ethan never did. Around this time, Clara began to recall something she had almost forgotten: the woman from the restaurant, the one who had been watching Ethan during their engagement phase. She had not seen her again directly, but the memory lingered, especially because Ethan had reacted so differently in her presence. One afternoon, while Clara and Ethan were leaving a bookstore after selecting a few reference materials, Clara noticed a figure across the street. A woman stood near a parked car, her posture composed, her gaze steady. She wasn't looking at Clara. She was looking at Ethan. Clara slowed her steps slightly, instinctively sensing the tension in Ethan's body. "Do you know her?" Clara asked quietly, following his line of sight. Ethan's reaction was immediate but controlled. "No," he said, a fraction too quickly. Clara didn't respond, but something inside her tightened. As they continued walking, Ethan subtly adjusted his pace, as if ensuring they didn't linger in that direction. That moment, though brief, created a new layer of curiosity within Clara's mind. Later that night, she revisited the memory of that woman, trying to connect the dots she had been trained to identify. There was something familiar about her presence, not her face, but her stillness, her confidence, the way she carried herself as someone who had a reason to be there. Clara couldn't explain it yet, but her instincts suggested that woman wasn't random. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone on the balcony that same evening, his phone in hand, staring at a name he had not contacted in months. Olivia Hart. His thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before he locked the phone without making the call. That hesitation wasn't new. It was a pattern he had been repeating quietly, avoiding a conversation that had never truly ended. Years earlier, Ethan's relationship with Olivia had been built on intensity rather than ease. They had met during a difficult period in his life, when financial pressure and personal responsibility weighed heavily on him. Olivia had been strong, assertive, someone who valued clarity and openness. Their connection had been genuine, but their communication had not been complete. Ethan had made a decision during that time, one that he believed was necessary, but never fully explained. He had taken a loan to support his younger brother's medical situation, a decision he kept from Olivia out of fear that she would worry or interfere. But when Olivia eventually discovered the truth through external circumstances, her trust fractured. The confrontation that followed was not explosive, it was quiet, but final. She had asked him one question that he never fully answered. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me? That question stayed with him, and though their separation appeared resolved on paper, the emotional closure never fully settled. The divorce process had begun, but complications related to financial obligations and legal timing had left certain elements incomplete, creating a lingering technicality that Ethan had chosen not to revisit until now. Back in the present, Clara sat by her window later that night, watching the city lights flicker below. Her thoughts were no longer just about Ethan's habits, they were about the gaps between what she saw and what she didn't. She remembered how he had once said, "Truth is expensive," and at the time, she had interpreted it as wisdom. Now, it felt like a warning. As she leaned back slightly, her eyes drifted toward the engagement ring on her finger, its quiet simplicity reflecting the same man she thought she understood. But beneath that simplicity was complexity she had only begun to sense. The engagement phase, which should have brought clarity, instead introduced questions, and those questions were not random. They were pointing towards something unresolved, something anchored in Ethan's past that had not yet been fully revealed. Clara didn't know Olivia's story yet, but she could feel her presence growing, not physically, but in the space between Ethan's words and his silences, and that presence, though unseen, was becoming harder to ignore. The days leading to the wedding moved quickly, almost too quickly, as if time itself was eager to push Clara and Ethan toward a moment neither of them was fully prepared for, though only one of them knew that. Clara immersed herself in the preparations, not because she was obsessed with perfection, but because she believed in meaning. Every detail mattered to her. From the softness of the fabric she chose for her dress to the simplicity of the flowers lining the aisle, white lilac, never red roses, a preference Ethan had remembered from the beginning. The detail alone reassured her more than it should have, as if his ability to remember small things proved that everything else was right. But love, she would soon learn, can be deeply attentive and still incomplete. Ethan, on the other hand, moved through the preparations with a calm that felt almost practiced. He attended meetings, nodded at suggestions, agreed to decisions, but there was a distance in him that Clara couldn't fully reach. It wasn't that he wasn't present, he was, but parts of him seemed elsewhere, occupied by thoughts he never voiced. One evening, 3 days before the wedding, Clara found him in the living room, sitting in silence with his phone in his hand, the screen dark, his expression unreadable. "You've been doing that a lot," she said gently, leaning against the doorway. Ethan looked up, slightly startled, then gave a small smile. "Doing what?" "Thinking without letting me in," she replied, her tone light, but her words intentional. Ethan exhaled softly, placing the phone beside him. "Just wedding pressure," he said. Clara walked closer, studying his face. "You don't strike me as someone who gets overwhelmed easily." He held her gaze for a moment, then reached for her hand. "I'm not overwhelmed," he said quietly, "just making sure everything is right." The words sounded reassuring, but something about the way he said them felt layered, as if everything included more than just the wedding. Clara wanted to ask more, but she didn't, not because she wasn't curious, but because she trusted him, or at least, she trusted the version of him she had come to know. That night, long after Clara had gone to bed, Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, his phone in his hand again. This time, he didn't hesitate as long. He scrolled to a name he had avoided for weeks, months even. Olivia Hart. The name alone carried weight, not just because of who she was, but because of everything left unresolved between them. He stared at it, his jaw tightening slightly, before finally pressing call. The line rang once, twice, then it connected. "I was wondering how long it would take." Olivia's voice came through, calm, steady, as if she had been expecting this moment. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "This isn't the way to handle things," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "This is the only way left." There was a pause, not empty, but filled with everything they hadn't said in years. "You're getting married," she continued, her tone unchanged. "That's what happens when people move on." "You didn't move on," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Ethan didn't respond immediately, because she wasn't entirely wrong. "What do you want, Olivia?" he asked finally. Another pause. Then, "The truth to be where it belongs." That sentence lingered longer than the call itself, because it carried an intention that was no longer hidden. Olivia wasn't reaching out to reconnect, she was reaching out to reveal. The next day, Clara attended a final dress fitting. Surrounded by soft music and quiet excitement, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman stepping into a future she believed in. As she adjusted the fabric slightly, her phone buzzed on the nearby table. She glanced at it briefly, expecting a message from a friend or family member. But the number was unfamiliar. She hesitated for a second before opening it. There was no greeting, no introduction, just a single line. "Ask him about Olivia before you say I do." Clara's fingers froze. Her heart didn't race immediately, it dropped, slowly, heavily, as if something inside her had just shifted into place. For a moment, she simply stared at the message, her mind replaying every small inconsistency she had noticed, every pause, every silence. This wasn't random. It couldn't be. Later that evening, when Ethan came to see her, Clara studied him more carefully than she ever had before. The way he smiled, the way he spoke, the way he avoided certain eye contact without realizing it. "Is everything okay?" he asked, noticing her quietness. Clara forced a small smile. "Yeah," she said softly. "Just thinking." Ethan nodded, accepting the answer, but not questioning it further. And that, more than anything, confirmed something Clara didn't want to admit. He had grown used to leaving things unspoken. As the wedding day approached, excitement filled the air for everyone around them. But beneath that surface, tension quietly built, threading itself through moments that should have been simple. Clara didn't confront him about the message, not yet, because part of her was still hoping it wasn't what it seemed. But hope, when placed against silence, can become fragile. And somewhere in the distance, unseen but very present, Olivia waited, not impulsively, not emotionally, but patiently, because she understood something Clara was only beginning to realize. Truth doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits for the moment it can no longer be avoided. And that moment was coming. The morning of the wedding arrived with a calmness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world had decided to give Clara one last moment of peace before everything shifted. Sunlight filtered gently through the tall windows of the bridal suite, casting a soft glow across the room where quiet preparations were already underway. Clara sat in front of the mirror, her reflection slowly transforming into that of a bride, her makeup subtle, her expression composed. Yet beneath that composure, something unsettled lingered. The message from the previous day had not left her mind. It hadn't grown louder, but it hadn't faded either. It sat quietly in her thoughts, like a question waiting for courage. "You're unusually quiet," her friend Leela said, standing behind her, adjusting the delicate fabric of her veil. Clara met her own eyes in the mirror before responding. "Just thinking about how everything changes after today," she said softly. Leela smiled. "That's normal. It's a big step." Clara nodded, but she knew that wasn't entirely what she meant. Change didn't scare her. Uncertainty did. And for the first time, since saying yes to Ethan, she felt uncertainty she couldn't clearly define. Across the city, in a separate suite, Ethan stood in front of another mirror, dressed in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, every detail precise, every line intentional. To anyone else, he looked like a man ready to begin a new chapter of his life. But his stillness betrayed something deeper. His phone lay on the table beside him, silent now, but not forgotten. The conversation with Olivia the night before had not resolved anything. It had only confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't something he could continue to avoid. His best man, Daniel, stepped into the room, adjusting his cufflinks casually. "You look like a man about to either get married or confess something," Daniel said lightly, watching him. Ethan gave a faint smile. "Maybe both." Daniel paused, picking up on the tone beneath the humor. "Everything all right?" Ethan hesitated, just briefly, then nodded. Yeah, he said, just a lot on my mind. Daniel studied him for a second longer, but didn't press. Well, whatever it is, today's not the day to overthink. You've got a good thing, Ethan. Don't complicate it. Ethan exhaled quietly after Daniel turned away, the words lingering in the air longer than intended. Don't complicate it. If only it were that simple. Back at the venue, guests began to arrive, their conversations blending into a soft hum of anticipation. The setting was elegant, but not excessive, reflecting Clara's preference for meaning over display. White lily lined the aisle, their fragrance subtle but present, each detail carefully chosen to reflect a love that was supposed to be honest and intentional. As Clara stepped out of the car, her dress flowing behind her, she felt a moment of stillness, as if time paused just long enough for her to take it all in. This was the moment she had imagined, not perfectly, but truthfully. What she didn't know was that someone else was watching that same moment from a distance. Olivia stood near the edge of the venue, partially obscured by the movement of arriving guests, her presence calm, composed, not disruptive. She wasn't there to create a scene. She was there to ensure something happened. Her eyes followed Clara briefly, not with jealousy, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, before shifting toward the entrance where Ethan would soon arrive. She had waited long enough. As the ceremony began, everything unfolded exactly as expected on the surface. Music played softly, guests turned their attention forward, and Clara walked down the aisle with a steady grace that masked the quiet tension still lingering within her. When her eyes met Ethan's, something softened again, just for a moment. He looked at her the way he always had, present, focused, intentional, and for a second, it felt real again. The vows were simple, personal, carefully chosen. Ethan's voice remained steady as he spoke, but beneath that steadiness was a weight he could no longer ignore. I promise to build a life with you that is honest, he said, the word honest landing heavier than the others. Clara heard it, not just as a promise, but as something unfinished. When it was her turn, Clara's voice carried emotion, but also quiet conviction. I choose you, she said, not because you are perfect, but because I believe in what we can build together. The ceremony ended with applause, smiles, and the visible relief of two people who had just crossed into a shared future. But beneath that moment, the truth remained untouched, unresolved, waiting. At the reception, the atmosphere shifted into celebration. Conversations flowed, laughter filled the space, and for a while, everything felt almost normal. Clara allowed herself to relax slightly, to lean into the joy of the moment, until she felt it again. That same presence, that same awareness she had noticed before. She turned subtly, her eyes scanning the room, and then she saw her, the woman from before, standing at a distance, not hiding, not approaching, just watching. Their eyes didn't meet directly, but Clara felt the connection instantly. This wasn't coincidence. This was intentional. Before she could process it further, Ethan appeared beside her, his hand resting lightly at her back. You okay? He asked softly. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, she said, though her attention lingered elsewhere. Ethan followed her gaze briefly, and in that instant, his entire posture shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Clara noticed. She always noticed. Do you know her? She asked quietly, her voice controlled. Ethan didn't answer immediately, and that delay said everything. Let's not do this now, he said under his breath. Clara looked at him, something inside her tightening again. Then when? She asked, echoing the same question from earlier days. Ethan's jaw clenched slightly, but before he could respond, someone approached them, interrupting the moment. The conversation ended, but not the tension, and somewhere in the room, Olivia remained, patient, watching, waiting for the moment she knew would come, because she understood something neither of them had fully faced yet. The truth doesn't interrupt when it's convenient, it arrives when it must, and for Clara and Ethan, that moment was no longer approaching, it was already here. The celebration faded into quiet as the night deepened, and what remained between Clara and Ethan was no longer music, no longer laughter, but a silence that felt heavier than anything they had shared before. The hotel suite door closed softly behind them, sealing them into a space that was meant for intimacy, for closeness, for the beginning of something permanent. But instead, it became the place where everything unspoken finally demanded to be heard. Clara didn't move immediately. She stood near the door for a moment, her fingers still lightly touching the handle, as if part of her considered leaving before the conversation even began. Ethan loosened his tie slowly, his movements controlled, but not calm. There was a difference now. The kind of calm he had worn before had been intentional. This one was strained. "You've been distant all evening," he said quietly, not turning to face her yet. Clara let out a soft breath. "And you've been avoiding me for weeks," she replied, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of everything she had held back. Ethan turned then, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because they both knew this was the moment they could no longer delay. Clara stepped forward slowly, her gaze searching his face, not for comfort, but for clarity. "I saw her," she said. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, but he didn't pretend not to understand. At the reception, Clara continued. "The same woman from before." Ethan exhaled quietly, running a hand through his hair. "Clara, don't," she interrupted gently, but firmly. "Don't start with that tone. Not tonight." There was no anger in her voice yet, just something more dangerous: certainty. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that this wasn't something he could redirect. Clara moved further into the room, her wedding dress brushing softly against the floor, a quiet reminder of what this night was supposed to be. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said, her voice lower now, more vulnerable. "Not part of it, not a version of it. The truth." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't try to manage the moment. He didn't soften it. He didn't delay it. But even then, the words didn't come immediately, and that hesitation again cut deeper than anything else. Clara felt it. "You're still deciding what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "That's the problem, Ethan. You're always deciding instead of just telling me." Ethan stepped closer, his expression heavy with something he could no longer contain. "I was trying to protect what we have," he said. Clara shook her head slowly. "No," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. "You were protecting what you didn't want me to know." The room fell into silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything that had led them here. Clara's mind raced, pulling together every small detail she had ignored, every moment she had chosen trust over doubt. The message, the pauses, the woman, the name. "Who is Olivia?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper now, but carrying more weight than before. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, as if the name itself carried a history he could no longer avoid. When he opened them again, there was no deflection left. "She's," he began, his voice lower now, stripped of the calm he had been holding on to. He paused, but this time, it wasn't avoidance, it was the weight of what he was about to say. "My wife." The word landed between them with a force that neither of them could soften. Clara didn't react immediately, not outwardly. Her body stilled, her breathing slowed, as if her mind needed a moment to process something that didn't fit into the reality she had built. "You're what?" she asked finally, her voice hollow, almost disconnected. Ethan didn't look away. He didn't correct it. He didn't try to reframe it. "My past," he said quietly. "One I didn't finish." Clara let out a soft, broken laugh, shaking her head slightly as she stepped back. "That's not a past, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling now. "That's a present." Her words hit him harder than anything else had, because she was right. The truth he had tried to contain, to delay, to resolve quietly on his own, it had followed him into this moment, into this room, into this marriage. Clara turned away from him, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady herself against the edge of the table. "How long?" she asked, her back still facing him. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Before you," he said. Clara let out a breath that sounded more like disbelief than relief. "No," she replied, turning back to face him, her eyes sharper now. "That's not what I asked." She stepped closer again, her voice stronger despite the emotion behind it. "How long have you been married?" "Without telling me." Ethan's silence answered before his words did, and that silence once again said everything Clara needed to know. The truth wasn't just hidden, it had been there all along, quietly shaping everything she thought she understood. And now, standing in the middle of what was supposed to be the beginning of forever, Clara realized something that shattered her more than the confession itself. She hadn't just married a man with a past, she had married a man whose past was still unfinished, and the truth of it had only just begun to unfold. Clara didn't speak immediately after Ethan's confession, not because she didn't have questions, but because something deeper had taken over. The slow, painful realization that everything she thought was complete had been built on something unfinished. And now, standing in front of him, she wasn't just hearing his truth, she was stepping into a story that had started long before her and had never truly ended. Ethan watched her carefully, aware that whatever he said next would not just explain the past, it would determine whether there was any future left to hold on to. "You deserve to understand all of it," he said quietly, his voice no longer defensive, no longer controlled, just honest in a way it hadn't been before. Clara's eyes remained on him, steady, though the emotion behind them was unmistakable. "Then don't leave anything out," she replied, and for the first time since they met, Ethan didn't filter his words. He let the past unfold exactly as it was. Years before Clara, before the calm life he had tried to build, Ethan had been living in a different city, a different version of himself, one defined more by pressure than stability. His younger brother, Lucas, had been seriously ill, the kind of illness that didn't just affect health, but consumed everything around it: time, energy, finances. Ethan had been the one holding everything together, taking on responsibility that felt heavier than he was prepared for, but refusing to let it show. That was when Olivia Hart entered his life. She wasn't fragile, not in any sense. Olivia was decisive, sharp, the kind of woman who valued clarity over comfort. They met through work, and what started as mutual respect quickly grew into something deeper, something intense, built not on ease, but on shared resilience. "She didn't need me to be perfect," Ethan said, his voice steady as he recalled it. "She just needed me to be honest." Clara felt that sentence land differently, because it wasn't just about Olivia, it was about the part of Ethan that had failed long before Clara ever knew him. "So what happened?" Clara asked, her voice quieter now, but still firm. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to hers. "I made a decision," he said, "one I thought I could handle on my own. As Lucas's condition worsened, the financial burden grew beyond what Ethan could manage. Medical bills piled up, and the pressure became something he could no longer contain quietly. Instead of sharing that weight with Olivia, instead of trusting her with the truth, he chose silence. He took out a significant loan, one that would affect not just him, but everything around him. "Why didn't you tell her?" Clara asked, though part of her already understood the pattern. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Because I thought I was protecting her," he said. "I didn't want her to carry that stress. I didn't want her to feel responsible." Clara's expression tightened slightly. "Or you didn't trust her enough to stand with you in it," she said softly. Ethan didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong. The truth had never been about protection. It had been about fear. Olivia found out not through him, but through the consequences. Debt collectors showed up, questions were asked, and suddenly, the truth Ethan had tried to control was no longer his to manage. "She asked me one thing," Ethan continued, his voice lower now. "Just one question." He paused, the memory still sharp. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me?" Clara felt the weight of that question, not just as something Olivia had asked, but as something she herself was now living through. "And you couldn't answer?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, his silence speaking before his words did. "I didn't know how to," he admitted. That moment had changed everything. Not through anger, not through dramatic conflict, but through a quiet shift that neither of them could undo. Olivia didn't leave immediately. She stayed long enough to see if Ethan would choose honesty over control, but he didn't, not fully, and eventually, she walked away. We didn't end because we stopped loving each other, Ethan said, his voice steady but heavy. We ended because we stopped trusting each other. The separation that followed was complicated, not emotionally, but legally and financially. The loan Ethan had taken created obligations that tied into shared assets and legal processes that couldn't be resolved quickly. Papers were filed, processes began, but delays, technical, financial, procedural, left things incomplete, and instead of confronting that unfinished reality directly, Ethan did what he had always done. He moved forward, telling himself he would fix it before it mattered. I thought I could close a chapter quietly, he said, before it ever reached you. Clara let out a soft breath, shaking her head slightly. But you didn't, she said. No, Ethan admitted. I didn't. Meanwhile, Olivia didn't disappear. She stepped back, yes, but she didn't forget. For her, the issue was never just the past, it was the lack of closure, the absence of accountability. And when she eventually learned that Ethan was building a new life, preparing to marry someone else without fully resolving what remained between them, something shifted, not out of jealousy, but out of principle. She doesn't want you back, Clara said slowly, piecing it together. Ethan nodded. No, she doesn't. Then why now? Clara asked. Ethan met her gaze directly. Because I never gave her the truth where it belonged, he said. And she's done waiting for me to do it on my own. The room fell into silence again. But this time, it was different. The truth was no longer hidden. It was fully present, fully understood, and impossible to ignore. Clara stepped back slightly, her mind processing everything, not just the facts, but the pattern beneath them, the way Ethan handled pressure, the way he avoided difficult truths, the way he chose control over vulnerability. And suddenly, the story made sense. Not just his past, but his present. You didn't just hide this from me, Clara said quietly. You repeated it. Ethan didn't respond immediately, because he knew she was right. The same silence that had broken his first marriage had followed him into this one. And now, it stood between them again. No longer subtle, no longer avoidable. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion, but also clarity. So what happens now? She asked, and for the first time, Ethan didn't have an answer ready. Because this wasn't just about fixing the past anymore. It was about whether the truth, now fully exposed, could still leave room for a future.
Clara didn't answer Ethan's question immediately. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, she understood that what she said next would not just shape the moment, it would shape everything that followed. And she refused to respond from emotion alone. She turned away slowly, creating distance between them, not out of anger, but out of clarity. The room felt different now, no longer a place of beginning, but a space where truth had rewritten everything. Ethan watched her carefully, resisting the instinct to close that distance, because he could see this wasn't a moment that could be fixed with closeness. I need time, Clara said finally, her voice steady, though the weight behind it was unmistakable. Ethan nodded once, slowly. I understand. But even as he said it, he knew that understanding didn't make it easier. Clara picked up her phone from the table, her movements calm, deliberate, as if she was holding herself together through control. She didn't look at him as she spoke again. I don't know what I'm standing in right now, she admitted, and I can't pretend I do. That honesty, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything else she had said that night. Ethan took a small step forward, stopping himself halfway. Clara, he began, but she shook her head gently. Don't, she said. Not right now. He stopped, because this time, he knew better than to push. Clara turned toward the door, her wedding dress still wrapped around her like a symbol that no longer felt secure. She paused briefly, her hand resting on the handle, as if giving herself one last moment to decide whether to stay or leave. But the truth had already made that decision for her. She opened the door and stepped out, not dramatically, not impulsively, but with a quiet finality that said more than anger ever could. The door closed softly behind her, and just like that, Ethan was alone. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had experienced before, not because of what had been said, but because of what had finally been understood. For the first time, he wasn't running from the truth. He was sitting in the consequences of it. He walked slowly toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass, his mind replaying everything Clara had said, everything Olivia had said, everything he had avoided. The pattern was clear now, impossible to ignore. He didn't lose people because he didn't care. He lost them because he didn't let them in. The next morning didn't bring relief. It brought responsibility. Ethan didn't reach for his phone to call Clara. He didn't try to explain further. Because he understood something now that he hadn't before. Words, without action, would only repeat the same cycle. Instead, he reached for the one thing he had avoided for far too long. He called Olivia. This time, there was no hesitation. The line connected quickly. "I was expecting that," Olivia said, her tone calm, but not soft. Ethan didn't waste time. "We need to finish this," he said. There was a pause on the other end, not out of surprise, but out of acknowledgement. "We should have finished it a long time ago," she replied. And this time, there was no argument in his voice. "You're right. The process that followed wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Meetings were scheduled. Legal documents were reviewed. Financial obligations that had once felt overwhelming were finally addressed directly. Ethan didn't try to minimize anything. He didn't try to delay anything. For the first time, he faced every detail fully, not because he wanted closure for himself, but because he understood that unfinished truths didn't stay contained. They followed him into every new beginning. As the days passed, Ethan found himself revisiting memories he had long avoided, not just of Olivia, but of the decisions that had led to everything unraveling. He remembered the moment he chose silence over honesty, the moment he convinced himself that protecting others meant withholding the truth. And he saw clearly now how that same pattern had followed him into his relationship with Clara. Meanwhile, Clara stayed away, not because she had stopped caring, but because she needed space to separate what she felt from what she now knew. She replayed everything in her mind: the early days, the proposal, the small silences she had ignored. And the more she thought about it, the more one thing became clear. Ethan had loved her. That part was real. But love, without truth, had not been enough to protect what they built. One evening, Clara sat by her window again, the city lights flickering below just as they had before, but her perspective had shifted. She wasn't just asking whether Ethan loved her. She was asking whether she could trust him again. And trust, once broken, wasn't rebuilt with words. It was rebuilt with consistency, with time, with truth. Back on the other side of the city, Ethan signed the final document that legally closed the chapter he had left unfinished. The moment was quiet, without ceremony, without relief that felt immediate. But it was complete. For the first time in years, there was no unresolved past following him, no hidden detail waiting to surface, no truth left unspoken. He stepped out of the office, the weight of what he had carried finally shifting, not disappearing, but settling into something he could now face honestly. But even as that chapter closed, one question remained, heavier than all the others. Had he done this too late? Because some truths, when delayed long enough, don't just change the present, they change what the future can become.
The days stretched into weeks, and the silence between Clara and Ethan settled into something neither of them could ignore nor easily bridge. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because what needed to be proven could no longer be spoken into existence. Clara had returned to her routines, back to the structured world of manuscripts and edits where everything had logic, where broken narratives could be fixed with clarity and intention. Yet this was different. This wasn't a story she could correct with red ink. This was something she had lived, something that had shifted her understanding of trust itself. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before, not about Ethan, but about herself, how quickly she had chosen belief over verification, how she had softened her instincts in the presence of love, how she had accepted silence where she would have questioned it in any other story. And yet, even with that awareness, her feelings for him hadn't disappeared. They had changed, deepened into something more cautious, more grounded, but still present. One evening, as she sat by her window reviewing a manuscript she had read twice already without truly absorbing it, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, expecting something routine. But it wasn't. It was Ethan, not a call. A message, simple, direct. "It's done." Clara stared at the words, her heart responding before her mind could organize its thoughts. She didn't reply immediately, not because she didn't understand what he meant, but because she did, fully, completely, and understanding carried weight. Across the city, Ethan stood outside her building, not by coincidence, but by choice. He hadn't told her he would be there. He didn't want to force the moment. He just needed to be present, to give her the option rather than the pressure. Clara stood slowly, her eyes still on the message, her mind moving through everything that had happened, everything that had been revealed, everything that had been fixed. Not erased, fixed. There was a difference. She picked up her coat, not fully aware of when she had made the decision, only that she had. Minutes later, she stepped outside, the cool air grounding her as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. And there he was, standing a few steps away, not approaching, not assuming, just there. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was everything they had been through, everything they had learned, everything that had changed. Ethan spoke first, his voice calm, but without the careful control he once carried. "I didn't come to ask you for anything," he said. Clara studied him, noticing the difference immediately. There was no hesitation in him now, no guarded pauses, just presence. "I just came to tell you, you were right," he continued, "about everything." Clara didn't interrupt. "I thought I was protecting people by holding things back," he said, his voice steady. "But all I did was leave them alone in things they deserved to understand." That honesty landed differently now, not as a promise, but as a realization. "I can't change how I handled the past," he added, "but I've faced it, completely. There's nothing left unfinished." Clara's eyes held his, searching not for perfection, but for consistency, for alignment between his words and who he had become. "And if you walk away," Ethan continued, "I'll understand. Because this time, I won't hide from the truth of it." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Clara stepped a little closer, not closing the distance fully, but enough to see him clearly. "You didn't lose me because you didn't love me," she said quietly. Ethan's expression softened slightly, but he didn't speak. "You almost lost me because you didn't trust me with your truth," she finished. He nodded once. "I know." Clara took a slow breath, her thoughts settling into clarity. "Love isn't what I'm questioning anymore," she said. "Truth is." Ethan didn't rush to respond. He simply stood there, allowing her to speak, to decide, to lead this moment in a way he hadn't allowed before. "If life gets complicated again," Clara continued, her voice steady but searching. "If something goes wrong, if things aren't easy." She paused, making sure he understood the weight of what she was asking. "Will you let me stand in it with you?" That question wasn't about the past. It was about everything that could still come. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation this time. "Yes," he said simply. No explanation, no justification, just certainty. And for the first time, Clara believed the answer, not because of the word itself, but because of the absence of fear behind it. She studied him for a moment longer, not rushing the decision, not allowing emotion alone to guide her. Because this time, she wasn't choosing blindly. She was choosing with understanding. Slowly, she stepped aside, not dramatically, not emotionally, but intentionally, creating space, an invitation, not a guarantee, but a possibility. Ethan didn't move immediately, because he understood what that gesture meant. It wasn't forgiveness given lightly. It was trust being rebuilt carefully. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, not with urgency, but with awareness. And in that moment, their story didn't return to what it had been. It became something different, something more honest, because forever, Clara realized, was never about perfection. It was about truth. And this time, the truth was no longer unspoken.